Oh, it's been a while. This is Professor Wham, and I'm late as usual. But, you know, I've got some things to say. Mostly what happens is that I get an idea and then I have to be inspired further, and then I have to do my rabbit hole searching. And all of that takes a while, especially when you have to work full time, and especially when, as in the last month, I have been battling a series of health related issues. So everything takes longer. And if you can see in the little corner the nature of my hair and what humidity does to it, this is kind of the way I have felt the past few weeks. Anyway, I was inspired to do this topic, queering the Vikings, because of several things that came together at once. I saw an interview that Leilani, one of my spiritual friends, shared with, it was more like a discussion than an interview, with an author, Deborah Lipp, who has written a book called Bending the Binary, in which she talks about the challenges of exercising what in Wicca is often understood to be the ideal of the male and female polarity among individuals who are queer or non-binary. So obviously this was for Pride Month, but it is an important question, and something that when I was in the neo-pagan community, even back in the 1980s and 1990s, was something that some people talked about. And then I also saw one of my other favorite YouTubers is a guy named I don't know what his name is, I can't remember it, but he refers to himself as the Welsh Viking. And his offering for Pride Month was answering the question whether or not bog bodies were gay people that the Vikings killed. In order to get rid of them, they just would throw them into bogs. And he handily dismisses that because, well, most of the bog bodies predate the Viking age by 1,000 to 2,000 years. And while there are a few examples from the texts, from extant texts and accounts, and also some examples of individuals who were executed not for being gay, but for things like adultery. There are a few instances like that. They don't resemble bog bodies. Bog bodies are a completely different thing. And apparently there were people on certain subreddits that were making that claim, that this is what, the white supremacist claims, obviously. This is what Vikings did to their gay people. They drowned them in bogs. No, they didn't. Absolutely no, they didn't. And he also talks about how, another thing that he talks about, well, and I'll talk about this later, is how you don't actually have the topic of homosexuality even coming up in law codes, and even in written, not Viking law codes, but Germanic law codes, until well into the Christian era. So it obviously wasn't something that concerned anybody from a legal perspective. Anyway, first of all, one of the things that I wanted to talk about here briefly, in just reminding everybody about these topics, is the word queer itself. When I say queering the Vikings, obviously the term queer has a certain connotation now, but it is kind of an odd word. We don't really know the origin of it. I did quite a little bit of searching, not only on the web, but in several other places. And there isn't a clear etymology to this word queer. Some linguists have linked it to an Old English word that means like traverse or cross-quartered in some way, like something that cuts across boundaries, which kind of makes a certain type of sense. But the first time it's actually used in literature in its present form comes from the 16th century, and it means odd or peculiar, and it can refer to anything. It doesn't necessarily refer to sexuality. In fact, it usually refers to like clothing, like queer clothing, or a queer feeling, like, that kind of an eerie feeling. Other sources have traced it to Low German or to Scottish. So it's like one of those words we really don't know where it comes from. It isn't until the 19th century that it is applied specifically to sexuality, and that's later in the century, and where you have people like Oscar Wilde, for example, actually claiming it. Obviously, it had been around for a while. So it's an interesting word, and it's gone through several permutations in the 20th century where, at first it was extremely pejorative, and now a lot of people are reclaiming it. In fact, just in my lifetime, when I first came out in the early 1980s, the word queer was really not a very good word, and so people didn't like to use it, at least in the communities I was in. So they would use the term gay, or they would use the term lesbian, depending on their sex or their identity, what they wanted to claim. But of course, this was a community that couldn't even utter the word bisexual without being terrified of it. But in the last decade or so, it has become more common for people to refer to themselves as queer, sort of as an umbrella encompassing, a variety of sexualities and gender expressions and identities. So it's kind of interesting. So what this is as a presentation, it's a little bit different, obviously, from some of my paranormal stuff, but it is something that concerns me specifically as a queer person. And so I wanted to respond a little bit, especially to some of the concerns and ideas that were rendered by Deborah Lipp, and also to talk a little bit about some of what I have found in some of the sources. When we talk about the Vikings, we talk about, the Germanic peoples like they are one thing in Europe. Obviously, white supremacists, Nazi sympathizers, they have their own very patriarchal view of what this is all about. They're historically completely incorrect, but the picture is pretty complicated, and so it's important to kind of get a sense of those complications. So I ended up, of course, digging into several rabbit holes, me. Now, it does seem to be true, at least for some scholars, that, and one of the scholars who has advocated the idea that there's a lot of queer stuff in Norse mythology is the scholar Britt Soley. This, by the way, is Heimdallr. Heimdallr he's trumpeting the beginning of Ragnarok, and this, of course, is the rainbow, the Bifrost Bridge, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but that's how the rainbow was seen. So Britt Soley has argued that, and I can't remember if she's a Danish scholar, but she's a Scandinavian scholar, and she has argued that there are a lot of queer elements that you can find in the Norse sagas and in the Norse mythology, and so she gives several examples, so I'll give these examples here. You have the famous Lay of Thrymskitha in the Poetic Edda, which describes how Loki convinced Thor to dress up as Freya in order to get his hammer back. Basically, Loki had pinched Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, and had given it to the giant. I believe that there was some kind of debt that Loki had to the giant, if I remember correctly, and this was sort of his way of repaying the giant back. He pinched Thor's hammer and gave it to this giant. And of course, Thor can't be without his hammer. So he goes to try to get the hammer back, and the giant says, the only way I will give up this hammer is if you bring Freya as a wife to me. In exchange for the hand of Freya, I will give Mjolnir back. So this is presented at the court of the gods, and of course everybody thinks it's hilarious, because what Loki suggests is that Thor dress up like Freya, and go and trick the giant and get his hammer back. So Thor, of course, doesn't want to do this. At first, it's really kind of framed as a comedy, but he finally does do it. He finally dresses up as Freya, and somehow manages to kind of fool the giant, sort of. Although the text says that there's some kind of doubt about him from time to time, because he eats so much. He doesn't eat the way a goddess would eat, I guess, and his eyes are flashing, in the way that the giant wouldn't anticipate that Freya's eyes would flash. But the giant can't really tell the difference. So the giant has Mjolnir on his lap, the hammer on his lap, and they're getting ready to do the marriage consecration, when Thor grabs his hammer and uses it to kill the giant, and of course gets away. So that's the story. So that's like one example. He dresses up as Freya. Thor dresses up as Freya in order to get his hammer back. Another example is the story that is told by Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote a history of the Danes, of the chieftain Frodo I, who dressed as a shield maiden in one of his eastern campaigns in order to confuse the enemy. There's also another example. This is I believe it's in a lay, which is a type of poem. That's where I remember it from. The story of Hervor from the Hervarar saga. There is a saga that kind of summarizes this, but there's also a poem that I remember this from, in which, upon discovering that her father, Hervor is a woman, upon discovering that her father was a famous berserker named Agantir, she conjured his spirit out of its how, that's its burial mound, out of its how, took his sword, and much to her ghost father's dismay, in fact, her father appears to her and says, "Don't do this." Don't do this. But she takes up his sword, and she swears to live as a Viking in his footsteps, wearing the dress of a man thereafter. There's the example of the legend of Hagbard and Signy, which features two star-crossed lovers. It's kind of a northern version of Romeo and Juliet, in which Hagbard disguises himself as a woman to get past Signy's guards. And there are several tales about Loki, in which he switches gender and sex, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. He actually gives birth to the three monsters that will destroy the world of the gods, that will bring on Ragnarok. And he generally flouts all manner of civil discourse about marriage and sex, while criticizing the gods for their hypocrisy. So, like I said, we'll talk about Loki in a little bit, because he's probably the queerest of all of the figures in Norse mythology. And then there is another famous example, which is not so nice, but kind of gives you a sense of how far this dude will go. So it provides a tangent for me to follow toward one of my rabbit holes. It's the story of Odin and Rindr, which is attested in several sources. So this was apparently a fairly well-known or widely dispersed story, in which Odin disguises himself as a woman healer in order to get to Rindr, whom he enchants and rapes. The text uses verbal forms which clearly indicate that Odin uses techniques of seidr, or seidr, in order to disguise himself or change his shape as a woman. And it was considered into a woman, and it was considered by Viking times to be a woman's magical art, in the province of Freya specifically. Rindr gets pregnant as a result of this rape and gives birth to the god that will avenge Baldur, who's one of the sons of Odin, during the last act of Ragnarok. So that's kind of an unpleasant story, but it's when Odin he doesn't actually just dress as a woman, he changes his shape into a woman, kind of like Loki is capable of doing. Now, there are a number of other sources that indicate that Odin learned this art of Seidr from Freya, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and that this form of auricular divination and soul traveling was associated, though not exclusively practiced by women, and by the time of the Vikings became seen as a province of the Finns and the Sami. So that, for example, in Njaal's saga, there is a fairly extended description of a woman and her entourage who come and do Seidr for a noble family. And it's scholars who've looked at this see she's very clearly depicted as wearing the costume of a Sami or Finnish seer. So she's kind of seen as an outsider, you know, someone who is not even of Norse origin, so to speak. Now, from my perspective, and of course this is a modern perspective, but from my perspective, I kind of disagree with Sully, this scholar, because none of these stories really seem that queer to me in the modern sense. Except for Loki, most of these stories are really just about cross-dressing or cross-acting, cross-presenting in order to accomplish some other goal. And in the case of Odin, not a great goal. In fact, a goal that you know, J.K. Rowling would go, see what can happen, you know, that kind of thing. Which I'm not going to say, and I don't think represents at all what trans people are trying to express today. But what this indicates to me is that at the time the stories were written down, in the Eddas and in the lays and in the sagas, at least from a social political perspective, it was expected that men and women, quote unquote, men and women, or males and females, had fairly strict in terms of performance, identifying clothing and behavior, had fairly strict demarcations. Extraordinary need could precipitate varied behavior from the norm, but the fact that the gods are portrayed as needing to cross-dress in order to get a job done, that right there indicates that there are some fairly strict, or understood to be some fairly strict ways in which gender is performed and sex is presented. Now, as always, I'm assuming that on the ground in everyday life, things were more nuanced. All right. Now, these are screenshots from the two YouTube presentations that I was talking about, and of course, I'll give links to these in the bottom. But this guy on the left, he's the Welsh guy, and the Welsh Viking guy, and the title of this presentation is, "Did the Vikings kill gay people and drown them in bogs?" So that's kind of the question that he's answering. And I've already explained how he says, no, they couldn't have been because bog bodies are older than the Viking period. But he also goes on to explain that there were no laws prescribing or even describing gay, lesbian, or queer behavior as such until well into the Christian Viking era. People think of Vikings as being always pagan. And there were, in fact, Christian Vikings in the later period. The word Viking is not a noun. We've used it as a noun to describe an era. But the people did not refer to themselves as Vikings, okay? They went a Viking. Viking is a verb. And so it describes what they're doing, not who they are. And this is something that is, you know, completely lost by the change of words over time. But there were Christian Vikings. There were people that did Viking-like things, particularly in the East. You know, when the people went a Viking, the Swedes went a Viking, the Rus went a Viking, and went into Kiev, which is now Ukraine, and went into Russia. There were many instances where people converted to Christianity and still went on those kinds of trips Sometimes they weren't pirates in quite the same way, but they still did Viking-like things, all right? But until late into that period, there were no laws that prescribed or even acknowledged, really, that there were gay, lesbian, or queers around, which at the very least meant that even if such behaviors were not considered typical, they were also not illegal or subject to persecution, even under such patriarchal examples as the late Visigoth law codes or the Burgundian law codes, which are actually both earlier than the Vikings and some of their law codes that developed, later on, but are very patriarchal. And so you would assume would probably have some description of illegal or illicit sexual behavior, and the only one that any of them mention is adultery. They don't talk about, what we think of as homosexual or queer behavior. This Welsh Viking guy also points out that in the class-conscious societies of the early Viking period, the socioeconomic status of the person that one got on with sexually was probably more important than their sex or gender. And as in most places, the more elite one was, the more one got away with. I mean, that's almost always true. The other side of that is the less important you were, the less it mattered what you did, as long as you did it with someone of your status. Now, what you also have to keep in mind is that marriage and having children in these societies was considered a norm because of the survival imperative. In a world where 3 out of 5 children might die before the age of 12, and about 1 in 5 women died in childbirth, and the average life expectancy was about between 31 and 35, getting the new generation out was a task that involved everyone. The margins were too slim. That's not to say queer people didn't exist. We know they did because of some records. There are actually some records here and there that talk about people who have ambiguous sexual organs or may behave in an sexually ambiguous way. I mean, obviously, sexually ambiguous organs, genitalia upon birth occur in approximately 1 in every 500 to 700 births. So obviously this would happen on occasion, and people would notice it. What they would do about it, it's not clear. There are no records about it. But we know that there are queer people that had to have existed, but many, if not most of them, would still have married and had children if possible. Okay? Just simply because survival was at a premium. Now, at the same time, within literature and art, there's no denying that, at least in mythology, Odin and his blood brother Loki might well have been considered queerish, not befitting some masculine ideal, and engaged and are often portrayed as engaged in some downright transgressive behavior. So we do know that there are some depictions of both of those characters where they are shown in various positions or situations. For example, there's a piece of Viking street art that has survived, which the Welsh Viking talks about, in which Odin is shown wearing the cap of a Finnish woman shaman while on the receiving end of a sexual encounter with a man. Okay? Now, this is often taken by scholars to be a crude Christian mockery of the deity, but it does provide a sense that at least some of Odin's magical pursuits were said to violate social norms. And certainly, in the records, I don't know if Odin was a literal person or not. I have my own theories about where Odin came from, which I will do perhaps in a different blog. But at least in the stories, Odin slept around, even by pagan standards. Several of the later sagas do refer to men who do Seidr as Seidr or Seidr men. And they describe them in effeminate terms, as if they are betraying their manhood in so doing. I can't remember, I seem to want to say that that the saga of Egil Skilligrimsson might actually have some depictions. I can't remember which saga it is now. And what is interesting about these is that, Finnish and Celtic men had been portrayed as doing similar practices without it besmirching their virility. So some scholars have concluded that since these texts are late, they're either influenced by Christianity or they reflect a change, perhaps, in certain understandings of what proper masculinity is. Now, some scholars have, in fact, concluded that the hypermasculine Marvel comic version of Odin and Thor, for that matter, that kind of came down to us, that is derived from an interpretation of what you find in the Eddas, was a deliberate attempt to remake both those deities in the face of Harald Fairhair's religious reformation following his alleged despotic attempt to unify Norway. So hold on just a sec. All right, so ever more books for you. Here are some things I'm going to be referring to. I will go back to the previous slide in just a little bit. But this wonderful book here on the left, Children of Ash and Elm, it's a narrative history of the Viking period. And it's actually one of the most readable accounts I've come across. It's massively fat. It's probably about that fat. And if you're looking at my picture, it's about that fat. But it is really well written. It is written by an expert in the field who lives in Scandinavia. I think he's a Swedish author, if I remember. He takes apart, what we know of archaeology, what we know of literature, and what the sagas and the Eddas say, and he just pulls them apart and constructs this history, from all the sources that we can come up with. And one of the great debates in Scandinavian scholarship has been whether or not there was a guy named Harald Fairhair, since he is named in a number of sagas, and what his role was in unifying Norway, if he managed to do that, and what the impact of that attempted unification could have had on religion among the Vikings. Part of the issue is that even though he's mentioned, Harald Fairhair is mentioned in a number of different sagas and other chronicles, there's very little absolute evidence of him that has been found on the ground in Norway. Although that could be just simply because the people who came after him got rid of those references. It's not clear. But according to the stories, he was a guy who had been raiding from, going a Viking from an early time period in his life. And he eventually figured out that he would accumulate more wealth if he hatched a kind of pyramid scheme. That basically he began to pressure traditional farmer jarls who had ancestral farms, ancestral holdings in parts of Norway. He began to pressure them to join the marauding in order to consolidate their own wealth. But of course, they would be loyal to him because he would lead their convoys, so to speak. He would underwrite their adventures, and then they would come and bring back stuff to him. And if this didn't work, he would seize their lands. I mean, according to what Neil Price says, there is sufficient evidence on the ground to suggest that at least one warlord, who we might as well call Harald, had this idea to do this. And that in response to this attempt by certain Viking, and in fact there was more than one person who had the idea to do this, that as warlords, in their greed for more booty, began this social process of pressuring traditional farmer jarls into joining this marauding. that it began to change the nature of the religion as well, because there came to be, especially among the pagan warlords who did this, one of the things that happened is they came to value the gods of the land less, in a way, and started to laud those deities that were more tricksy, that were more mercurial, and basically kind of recreated an aristocracy of the gods that reflected in some ways their own desire for aristocracy. I mean, what we forget is that the Eddas and the sagas, upon which, for example, modern Asatru is largely built, are legacy productions of a recently ascendant aristocracy, which saw Thor and Freyr, who are both originally kind of earth deities, reinterpreted, and Tyr, who is the ancient sky god of justice, there's lots of evidence on the ground that Tyr was far more important than he ends up becoming in the Eddas. He was an ancient sky god of justice who was understood to be one of the sources from which justice and balance and righteousness came from. But in the Eddas, you see him being relegated to being one of the sons of Odin, the rather amoral allfather who inspired both berserkers and the wily, sneaky magician Egil Skallagrimsson alike. And in fact, my own opinion, as not someone who is a big expert on this, but who has read most of these texts, is that if you want to kind of see this change in action, read two sagas. Read the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, who is a magician, a black magician, who is loyal to Odin and who sells his magical skills specifically to these warlords who are attempting to seize land from their own relatives in some instances. And also read Njal's saga, which is one of the sagas that describes the settling of Iceland. And it describes the coming of Christianity to Iceland. But it's got some instances of this in it too. You can really see how the people who were coming to Iceland from Norway were fleeing this kind of crap that was going on with the warlords at home. And they had to sort of figure out how they were going to reconstruct their religion in the face of that. So, what I'd recommend is if you're thinking about this, read deeply into these two sagas, because there's a lot of really interesting social things going on. Now, some have even argued that the mythical divine fight that you see talked about in both Eddas between the Ausur and the Vanir, the two races of gods that are recorded, may reflect the advent of this Viking religious innovation. In the past, most scholars have argued that the story of this divine conflict reflects the meeting between older agricultural cultures with invading Indo-European horsemen, as one finds reflected in the Rig Veda, for example. However, there was a very real conflict between the new Viking pirate explorers and the traditional landowners who had no interest in invading others. Jarls were tied to their land by inheritance in the ancestors. Their wealth was not gained by raiding and robbing others. The nouveau riche that emerged out of the Viking migrations would come to value the tricksy, mercurial Odin as their model, and older traditions, such as Seidr, would come to be seen as foreign and quaint. That way of thinking also recast women as something increasingly other, mysterious, and foreign. And obviously, as Christianity moved into this milieu, it played its part as well. Now, one of the places where you can see this change happening sort of on the ground is in the language around gender identity and status, is in Old English. and as Old English morphs into Middle English in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain. In Old English, the word man, often spelled M-A-N-N or mon, which we might recognize as the basis for the word man, meant human being. It could also designate a mature female human. However, it did not automatically refer to a mature male human. Mature male humans could only become mon, or human. Human is from the Latin, by the way. Once they married, had a household, and produced some kind of offspring, either by procreation or adoption or fosterage. So let me say that again. Mature male humans could only become mon, or human, once they married, had a household, and produced some kind of offspring, either by procreation or adoption or fosterage. Mature male humans who did or did not or could not succeed in these requirements remained wer, that's the word, wer, W-E-R, which has the general connotation of being uncouth, undeveloped, and uncivilized. The same prefix is used in werewolf, which of course means man-wolf, right? Wer, man-wolf, wild man-wolf, not just man-wolf, but wild man-wolf. So adult female humans were automatically mon, or human, regardless of their marital status, but adult male humans had to become mon, or fully human. Now, by the time Middle English rolled around, after the Norman invasion and the steady drip of Christianity, mon became man and came to designate a human or an adult male human. Adult female humans were recast as woman, a type of human, perhaps derivative, as in the Adam and Eve story. Men were, women could be included in men as a type, but were also separate. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that the Eddas and the Sagas were written subsequent to this transformation into Middle English, but reflect many of the same changes, even though they are in a different language and in a different part of Europe. Now, Maria Hvilhaug, the center book here, in her amazing Seeds of Yggdrasil, this is the second edition of this book. I have both editions of the book. And again, it is a massively fat book, has demonstrated how ideas about sex and gender were changing as reflected in the Eddas by simply looking at the literal translations of names such as Gulverger and Gunungagap and even Odin. For Hvilhaug, the literal meanings of proper names in particular shed important light not only on how gender and sex came to be viewed by the Vikings and individual, populations in the immediate post-Viking period, but also provide clues about older meanings and significances that were in the process of passing away by the time the texts were written. This is important because the original audiences would probably have remembered at least some of the original meanings. Thus, the oftentimes multi-layered meanings of the texts then would have been clear to them in a way that they aren't now. So that, for example, when we're reading the Poetic Edda, as she says, we'll read the term Gulveg, or the name Gulveger, which is usually understood to be an epithet of Freya. And it's often been translated to mean hungry for gold, or gold hunger, like she's greedy. But that's not what the name literally means. What the name literally means is more complicated than that, and it has to do with the one who bestows gold. And it's not physical gold. It's the one who bestows the gold of wisdom, the gold of knowledge, the one who is the fount of those things. So you can see how a difference in translation changes how you see this figure. Now, what Hvilhaug discovered is that the oldest strata of gender and sex signifiers, even in Old Norse, are much less binary than previously thought, and certainly don't divide the world up into a tidy female-male package. Sorry, followers of both Asatru and Wicca. More radically, the creation of the worlds from Gununga Gap, which is often translated as magically charged void, which is kind of cool anyway. When she takes it apart, what you realize is that it doesn't mean that. What it means, it's not magically charged void. What it literally means something like the womb that produces things of its own accord. In other words, it's like the principle of parthenogenesis, essentially. So more radically, the creation of the worlds from Gununga Gap was described in purely feminine terms or female terms. Namely, there is nothing opposite or even complementary to the primary female goddess forces that gave rise to the world through an act of parthenogenesis. As she linguistically goes through the creation of the world, as you find in the first poem of the Poetic Edda, what you find, she says, is that male energy, or energy that is defined or linguistically described as male, is depicted as emerging from female creative forces as an additional expression of female fecundity altered for the sake of vitality and focus. So whatever maleness is, according to these texts, it's something that femaleness produced on its own, for its own purposes. Now, while it is true that the Eddas depict humans as being created by male god forms, that's where you get on the left here, the children of Ash and Elm. This is reflecting one of the stories of a tripartite god coming and creating men and women out of ashes and elms, two different trees. Those male energies had their origin in the original female womb of the cosmos. And even the word Edda reveals this clue, as it specifically means grandmother, not grandparents. For at least Germanic Northern Europeans, and this is another example, the sun was a goddess, Sunna, because of her constant life-giving light, whereas the moon was a god, Mino, gives us the word moon, because it was inconstant, wandering, and subject to moods, like an uncivilized, unmarried, adult male human. So within this context, cross-dressing, particularly on the part of men, since it's, in all the examples that I gave, it's usually men that are doing it, could have been seen as an attempt by male adult humans, or a god, an attempt to take on the disguise of the original template of humanity. Or, if these tales are being told to Christians, as a means by which to ridicule old deities that would dare to do such a thing. A Viking audience would have seen all these allusions as ancient history, a connection to the ancestors if one was pagan, an allusion to old paganism of the past if one was Christian. Now, what I did want to do is read a little bit from the Seed of Yggdrasil. A lot of this book is like in really short essays because they reflect short YouTube offerings that she has done. So this is part of a chapter in which she talks about the maiden with the mead and what was often referred to in the Eddas as red gold. Red gold was distinguished from regular gold in that red gold was a kind of, it was sort of a metaphorical gold. It's the actual gold that heroes went after when they were trying to get gold from dragons, for example. it represents a kind of rich wisdom, a kind of of fount of eternal knowledge. It's the ability to connect to the gods, the ability to connect to other worlds. Those were the riches that Odin is said to constantly be looking for, and to do a great deal of take a great deal of effort to find. But this is often represented metaphorically as a kind of as a kind of mead. Mead was something that was shared in the hall, in the social hall. But it was also something that became primarily understood as the truth teller. When folks were getting drunk in the Viking halls, they weren't just getting drunk. I mean, they did get drunk, but the drinking was done in a very specific way. And you didn't do it all at once. And it was very important that an individual be able to hold their drink, be able to monitor how much they drank, and control themselves, because it was when drink was imbibed that the truth was often told, or the truth of one's true character was revealed. That was the whole idea behind it. So anyway, as she puts it, we have been presented with the goddess of the Vanir, Freya, who first arrived on the cosmic scene as a Völva. This is a seer, who conquered death before the eyes of all the gods. Later she moved through the world as a wandering witch, helping and teaching the people through the art of Seidr. The Ausur, wanting to gain control over this most powerful of all arts, started a war with her people, the Vanir, and ended up with a truce involving the arrival of Freya and her three kinsmen into the realm of the gods. So this is what the first poem of the Poetic Edda, this is the story it tells. Then Odin and his Ausur could learn the art of Seidr also. Freya thus stands out as the great spiritual mentor of the Ausur and takes up her position as a priestess among them. The fact that the goddess is called Gullvergr, or gold power drink, that's, the drink that bestows power to you, is a way of identifying the goddess with the sacred drink itself. This is in accordance with the name of Njord's eldest daughter, Redvegr council drink. It is also in accordance with the way both the mead is said to be covered by shields in hell, and the way the sleeping Valkyrie is likewise covered by shields in the realm of death. Also, if we realize that the mead offers rejuvenation and resurrection, we can see the mead in connection to the apples of Ithun, who is also called the Olgefin, the ale provider, and who is obviously identified with her apples. No one can eat the apples unless she is present, and her nickname, Seed of Yggdrasil, is not coincidental. So the drink serving, and the drink guarding goddess are ultimately connected and seem to be the same. The mead is also served by the goddess Sif in the Lokasena, where she tries to ease the anger of Loki, who we'll be talking about here in a minute. After Loki had drunk her mead, he declares that he has tricked her and had her, as if drinking her mead is the same as sleeping with her. Curiously enough, the drink is also served by a male god, Vithar, which means expanding wood warrior, the silent. There is one other poem where a male serves the mead to another male, and that is in Grimminasal, where the young boy, Agnar, which means respect warrior, serves the mead to Odin and receives great cosmic revelations in return. If the goddess represents something like the core soul of all gods, regardless of gender, the ultimate fate spinner, much like all humans, regardless of gender, possess a personal fate spinner attached to their souls, we may better understand how the goddess can be the mead or the origin of the mead that she offers, yet how the mead and its provider may sometimes be disguised within masculine entities as well. It seems to me that the two cases of male drink providers metaphorically describe the offering of nourishment to a quality within the man. In the case of Vidar the Silent, this god probably represents the expanding wisdom that comes out of inner silence, attempting to quiet the incessant raging rant of blind Loki, the inner wisdom reaching out to the foolish mind. In the case of Agnar, the offering of drink to the bound god is a young man's choice to nourish his own spirit. The fact that the essentially same realm, the same mead, and the same woman is described within all the various worlds, the worlds of giants, gods, elves, Norns, and Valkyrie, is only obscure and confusing as long as one insists that we are speaking of geographical borders and physical species. We could compare this with how the same mead is contained in 3 different vessels. The underlying message is unifying, suggesting that there is a deeper reality behind the metaphors of poetry, where a golden, bright maiden serves a mead of wisdom, light, healing, universal memory, and a path of salvation along with her own self, and that the foundation of this wisdom is fundamentally female. Now, this brings me back to this interesting discussion that was happening between Leilani and Deborah Lipp. And it was, I would highly recommend it. Like I said, I'm going to give you the link to it, and so you can listen to it. But one of the things that Deborah Lipp talks about is that are the challenges that people who are non-binary or in unusual or queer relationships, at least as far as our culture is concerned, have when dealing with Wicca in particular, that is so wed to the idea of balancing male and female as if male and female are opposites in some ways. She never really talks about how, like in the Taoist sense, they could be complements, but, they're kind of referred to as opposites. So what it appears as if the earliest Germanic conceptions of the universe, according to Maria Quillhag, were not so patriarchal after all, and didn't parse the world into gender polarities, at least the ultimate reality into gender polarities. Rather than females or women being different and possibly lesser men, and that's to paraphrase Aristotle, males or men had their origins in, were derived from women or females in exactly the opposite of Genesis. Now, this sort of belies the idea of polarity, such as it is often talked about today in many occult and magical circles. Rather than the notion of opposites, as I mentioned, I often find it more useful to talk about how different genders or sexes complement each other. Sometimes I hear magical workers who are committed to the idea of male or female as being analogous to the negative positive poles of a battery. And in fact, Deborah Lipp actually talks about this, although she does say that, from an electrical standpoint, even though we talk about negative and positive poles, from the point of view of the electricity itself, we're just talking about different forces. There's nothing that's negative or positive about them. They're just different forces. Namely, you need both poles for electricity to flow. Now, even though we know that the notion of negative/positive is simply a description, one could also just say A and B forces. We are simply talking about, different ways in which electricity expresses itself. Our associative way of thinking can't help but attach the terms negative and positive to male and female in some fashion, which automatically causes us to think of the sexes and genders as opposites. And we know this because we deal with it all the time. And in fact, what's interesting about Deborah is that even though she talks about this, she then, and admits this, she then talks about how she and her partner, for example, express different binaries in their personal lives. However, and this is my contention, humans are not batteries. We have a great deal more creativity, flow, and choice. For me, this occult obsession with male or female or active and responsive, negative, positive mapping is simply wrong and incomplete, and is more of a reflection of just, what we've gotten accustomed to seeing here. And it doesn't always reflect what the ancients, for Europeans, our ancestors, necessarily believed. What Maria Quillhag seems to be saying is that even though we think of Viking culture as being very patriarchal, and it's often, portrayed that way, that even in their sources, there was an acknowledgement that at the beginning of things, it was perhaps the opposite. What this does is it reminds me of something that a Mexican elder, one of my teachers, told me. We were talking about, trans people and queerness and, two-spirited people and things like that. And she said, first she said, don't get me wrong here. I don't want you to misconstrue what I'm saying. She said, but my own feeling, looking at European white colonial culture, my own feeling is that part of the reason why there seems to be so many people wanting to claim these different identities. And even though in true numbers, it's not that many people, there seem to be lots of people because of social media, and there actually are probably no more of these people than there've ever been. She said, part of the reason I think that there's a furor about it is because in the West, the female and being female and female bodies have been so denigrated, so completely denigrated, that this is an attempt to try to achieve some kind of balance in whatever way the individual who is caught in, these feelings about themselves and their bodies can do it or are doing it. She said, and each individual is different. Some people may actually be being born into the wrong body. Some people may be picking up things about the body, about their body, from culture. She said each soul is different and needs to be treated differently, needs to be treated uniquely. But all of this is because, she says, we in the West have so denigrated women and women's bodies, seeing them as the seat of sin, seeing them as, all I have to do is look at the stereotypes, the grand symbol system that women get to choose from. You can be a whore of the Virgin Mary or a mother. Those are your choices, basically. You can't just be a person. These attempts to control women's reproduction, to control women's health choices. This is about controlling women. Now, my own sense is that the obsession with getting the genders balanced, say in Wicca or whatever, has more to do with the influence of the Hermetic Kabbalah on the Order of the Golden Dawn, and then how that all sort of passed into many, if not most, occult magical schools in the West today. And in fact, Deborah Lipp talks about that a little bit, about how, the way in which these binaries are seen in the West, in many magical schools, has a lot more to do with the way in which the Golden Dawn used Hermetic Kabbalah than anything else. Now, we do have to talk a little bit about Loki. Of all the gods, or all of the divine beings, if you want to put it that way, Loki is the one who is depicted as most obviously queer, queer or transgressive, if you will. He's the odd guy out. He's in between. He is more related to the giants than to the gods themselves, whether Auser or Vanir. He is capable of shape-shifting his sex and gender so completely that as a she, he gives birth to the three monsters who will eventually destroy the world. The Eddas depict Loki as irreverent and taunting, pushing the gods to demonstrate their true natures and vulnerabilities, but helping them pull off the saving act in the end, oftentimes. Not all the time, but oftentimes. Now, of course, Christianity would class him with the devils, although there's no actual evidence that Loki was worshipped in the same manner that other deities such as Thor and Freyr and Freya were. And of course, this right here, this is actually from a Tumblr post. I was not able to find out who actually created this graphic, but this is based on, the Marvel comic view of Loki, who of course Meister Tom, in the Marvel movie series, has portrayed so admirably. I say as queer icon, disruptor, and pole dancer because there's that famous scene where he's fighting Thor in one of the movies, and he uses his spear as a kind of a pivot around which he twirls so that he can kick Thor and try to come out on top of the fight. And so fans of him, fans of this particular character and of the actor who plays him, have often done fan art depicting him as a pole dancer, which I think is actually hilarious. But one of the better books that describes Loki, essentially, is this one by Leah Svensson, Loki and Sigyn. And it's a really interesting combination of both scholarship, looking at what the sources say about Loki, and then looking at personal gnosis and personal experience, not only of her own, but of a whole host of Lokians who have emerged in the larger heathenry community since the 1990s, mostly since the split between members of the Troth and the Asatru. What was the Asatru Folk Assembly and is now I think it was the Asatru. I can't remember now. It was either the Asatru Free Assembly that became the Folk Assembly or the Folk Assembly that became the Free Assembly, whatever. But Loki is an interesting character, and there have been several attempts to try to figure out what he might have meant. There have been linguistic studies, which this book actually does delve into, which possibly connect Loki to being a fire deity. In other words, that he is the deity of the fire. He is the fire into which offerings are placed, which makes sense to some degree linguistically, and it would make sense if in terms of Indo-European mythology, because there is no Indo-European mythology that exists, whether it's Greek or Turkish, not Turkish, Greek or Hittite or Aryan or Roman, that does not include a fire or hearth deity. But Norse tradition seems to be interestingly lacking that, and Loki would fill the bill. So it kind of describes that. It describes the possible relationship between Loki and his wife Sigyn, and why Loki has been embraced by the queer members, many of the queer members of the heathen community. Essentially, it's a very interesting sort of derivation. She's connected with the Northeast heathen community, which is a community that I'm not attached to, but I'm very I know people that are in it. Because of the nature of Loki, because he's considered to be a trickster and sort of a troublemaker and a boundary breaker, individuals who were devotees of his, including many people in the queer community, the larger heathen queer community, were not permitted to do any specifically Loki rituals or ceremonies at troth moots, gatherings of the troth, until the troth lifted what they called the Loki ban in 2018. So, and you can see here, right here, the Northeast, I'll just read this. The Northeast heathen community still isn't over the fear and mistrust of Loki. When the Troth finally lifted the Loki ban in 2018, an unofficial decree that had been in place since 2008, it started the fight anew. Many people left the Troth, enraged at the concept of Wergild being paid to Loki by holding a bloat to him at Trothmoot every year for 10 years, one bloat for each year he was banned. A collection of poems, stories, and essays regarding Loki was even published And April 2021 is one of the Troth's devotionals. And they don't want, they're afraid of Loki, Loki being the person who initiates Ragnarok, being a force of chaos. But if you think about it, that's exactly what queer means. Queer is something that is disruptive. It's a person who's disruptive. It's a situation that's disruptive. It's someone who makes you uncomfortable because they reveal a truth. And that's exactly what Loki does in the myths. He reveals a truth. He reveals the hypocrisies of the gods. He reveals their vulnerabilities. Some say yes, but he gives birth to the 3 monsters that destroy the world. Well, here's the deal. The word monster in Latin means a warning. So he gives birth to the 3 warnings. The 3 warnings. Now, what are the 3 warnings that he gives birth to? Well, probably the most consequential of these warnings is the warning of one of the warners is Surt. He's the fire giant who causes an overheating of the world. And then there is Fenrir, who is bound by Tyr, the god of righteousness and justice and balance. He's bound by Tyr, but is released at the beginning of Ragnarok, and his name means greed. And Odin, whose name means ecstatic inspiration, is devoured by Fenrir, by greed. And then the last of these monsters is Jormungand, the great serpent who holds the axis of the world together. So Jormungand is released, and the world goes through earth changes. So Loki gives birth to these warnings. And I think on some level that's kind of the real fear of queer people, that people who are not queer, whatever that means, have of queer people. Is that a lot of people, maybe most people, are so closely identified with their body as the essence of who they are. Their genitalia, their sexuality is the essence of who they are. That to see somebody do something different with that, to actually change their body, to actually opt to make some very interesting alterations, kind of freaks them out. It doesn't have anything to do with you, but if you're really tied to a certain kind of literal physical interpretation of the world, and you see somebody doing something different, it can kind of make you uncomfortable, because all of a sudden you're reminded that, in fact, the world is not necessarily as you see it. It is perhaps what you make of it. And with that, I will have queered the Vikings. These are just all things to think about. There's no conclusion here. I've mentioned this before, and this is the one paranormal moment in this presentation. In Whitley Strieber, whatever his name is, in his book Transformation, is that what it is? It's a second communion book. I think it's Transformations. It's one that's got the blue alien on it. In an appendix, he relates the story of Betty Andreasen Luca, the late great Betty Andreasen Luca, who died not too long ago. When she was first being hypnotized by individuals who were, I think it was Ray Fowler's group, who were hypnotizing her to see if, to try to help her recall her abduction memories. And it has to be said here that Betty was a Pentecostal, she was raised a Pentecostal Christian. And so she was accustomed to speaking in tongues. And in the middle of one of these sessions, these hypnosis sessions, she started speaking in the middle of her session, she started speaking in this language. She started speaking these syllables that were recorded. And it was assumed at the time that it was kind of a glossolalia, that it was a reflection of her Pentecostal background kind of asserting itself. And not a great deal of thought was given to it until one of the scholars that had been retained by Ray Fowler heard it, listened to it, and thought that this sounded like words that he had heard before, that they were familiar to him in some way. So he had another friend of his listen to it, a linguist, and they realized that the words were in an old Irish Celtic dialect, were enough in a Celtic dialect that if you listened carefully, you could get meaning out of the words. You could, in other words, they could be translated. And I've always been haunted by that translation in light of everything that I've been talking about today. And the translation goes something like this. The children of the northern peoples are stumbling in universal darkness. Their mother mourns. A dark occasion forebodes when weakness in high places shall revive a high cost of living, an interval of mistakes in high places, an interval set for distressing events.